Good evening. It is 2100 hours Central African time, and I am Tandeka Gubulembeki, and you are watching Economics Unbound. Well, two major facilities at the heart of Saudi Arabia's oil industry were attacked on Saturday, shutting down more than 5% of global supply, leading to a record spike in the oil price. Hello, Nana.
Good evening. I'm Nana. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, we look into what the attack on the Saudi Arabia means for South Africa and the rest of the world. Tans, on Monday, US President Donald Trump said the US was locked and loaded for a potential response to the attack. The US also said evidence from the attack indicated that Iran was behind it, but Tehran has denied this.
Yes, Nana. However, China's foreign ministry said it is irresponsible to blame anyone for an attack on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities without conclusive facts. Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthi group has claimed responsibility for the attack, but U.S. State Secretary Mike Pompeo said there was no evidence the attack came from Yemen. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump said it looked like Iran was behind the attacks on oil plants in Saudi Arabia at the weekend that raised fears of a fresh Middle East conflict. But Trump added that he did not want war with anyone. Iran has rejected U.S. charges that it was to blame for the attacks, which damaged the world's biggest crude processing plant and triggered the largest jump in crude prices in decades.
That was a very large attack, and it could be met with an attack many, many times larger very easily by our country, but we're going to find out who definitively did it first.
Can we clarify, Mr. President? So you said that you think that Iran is responsible for the attack. Do you think that
I didn't say that. Why do you say that? I said that we think we know who it was, but I didn't say anybody. But certainly it would look to most like it was Iran, but I did not say it the way you said. Go ahead.
Do you think it was launched from Iran as the second point?
You're going to find out in great detail in the very near future. We have the exact locations of just about everything. You're going to find out at the right time, but it's too early to tell you that now.
But Tans, reports suggested that the US government issued satellite images to back its claim that Iran was behind the attacks. The attack was reported to have knocked out more than half of Saudi Arabia's output, also constraining its ability to use more than 2 million barrels per day of spare oil capacity held for emergencies to compensate for any major global supply disruption. But what does all of this mean for South Africa and the rest of the world?
Well, you see, Nana, the rise in oil price globally will ultimately affect the price of petrol in South Africa. The price surge follows a weekend attack on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, as we've said, which means there are fewer oil reserves to go around. Our country does not have sufficient oil reserves because, remember, our government sold some of these a few years ago. The petrol price was expected to come down in September, but that has all but fizzled out. An increase in the fuel price will also add to inflationary pressures.
Tans, is this why the Automobile Association postponed its mid-month forecast for October prices?
Well, Nana, I think so. But you see, the record spike in the oil price, which jumped 20% at the start of trading on Monday, has probably dashed all hopes of a South African fuel price cut in October. The Automobile Association was due to publish its mid-month forecast for October prices on Monday, but now it has postponed its announcement until it has a clearer picture of oil price movements. Now, let's take a look at this graph my colleague Francis Hurd prepared earlier on.
Here's the dramatic increase. The future price for Brent crude, which South Africa imports for fuel, is the global benchmark. This is a 5-day chart. It started off the day at around $60 per barrel. Then it jumped way up here by nearly 20% to nearly $72 per barrel, going up, up, up. The actual price of oil, of course, has been much higher than this, even higher than $100. But this was the biggest jump in one day since 1991. By the close of business, you can see it had moderated somewhat. Prices had cooled, but they were still up by 11% or so at around $67 per barrel. Now, the market is still jittery after 5% of global supply was wiped out in a single strike. And heightened tensions in the Middle East because of this could mean higher oil prices for some time. The attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities basically halved production for the kingdom. Remember, Saudi is the de facto leader of the cartel of oil-producing nations, OPEC, and it is the world's biggest exporter of oil. Now, it is a big country, it's the big countries, rather, that import fuel that will be hardest hit. That's India, China, and Indonesia. South Africa is also a net importer of oil and will be impacted by the higher prices.
Yo, this drone attack seems to be the single worst sudden disruption ever in the world oil market, bigger than the loss of production from Kuwait and Iraq after the latter's invasion of Kuwait, and also larger than the outage due to the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979.
Indeed, Nana. Oil surged along with gold and treasury futures after a strike on the heart of Saudi Arabia's oil production increased geopolitical risk concerns. The US and European equities futures declined, while shares in Asia were mostly slower.
The news of the devastating attack also sent currencies of commodity-linked nations higher, including the Norwegian krone and Canadian dollar. Saudi Arabia is currently trying to restore production, but the political tensions triggered by the attack could have a lasting impact on the global oil market as tensions between the US and Iran escalate.
Well, yes, Nana. For now, let's take a short break and we will unpack this further after we return. Stay with us, dear viewer. Don't go away. Well, welcome back. Some analysts have warned that oil prices could hit $100 per barrel this year. This follows attacks on the world's largest crude processing facilities in Saudi Arabia on Saturday. This incident has forced the Gulf country to cut output by half.
Analysts say a shortage in global oil supply could see a repeat of the global recession that was last seen in the 1970s. The gold price rose by more than 1.5% as investors seek alternative safe havens. This follows fears that the disruption in Saudi Arabia's oil supply could have dire consequences for the global economy. Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthi group has claimed responsibility for the attack. But the United Nations Yemen envoy Martin Griffiths says it was not entirely clear who was behind the attack. Griffiths was addressing the United Nations Security Council, saying the incident raises the chances of a regional conflict. Britain's UN ambassador, Karen Pierce, also says it's unsure about who's responsible for the attacks. Meanwhile, Russia is urging countries across the Middle East not to draw hasty conclusions about who staged the attacks. The Kremlin says Russian President Vladimir Putin has not offered to help Saudi Arabia deal with consequences of the attacks, which did not affect preparations for Putin's upcoming visit to the country.
Now, at the same time, there are fears that the disruption in oil supply could bring dire consequences to the global economy and a repeat of global recession.
It will make a global recession much more likely because Europe is already in the throes of recession. Chinese growth in China is slowing down, and growth in the U.S. is slowing down. The last thing we need is a spike in oil prices and a disruption in oil supply. If Saudi Arabia cannot defend its oil fields and the Houthi rebels launching further attacks, then we will have a repeat of the recession of the 70s after the oil shocks, and which is really very dire for the global economy.
The matter was also discussed in a meeting of the United Nations Security Council in New York.
The drone attacks are reported to have knocked out half of Saudi Arabia's oil production, the most severe blow against the kingdom in the over 4 years of their involvement in Yemen's civil war.
And this is frankly terrifying and is an eventuality which runs completely counter to the many and detailed conversations I have had in recent weeks with people in the region, in Yemen and elsewhere, in favor of a series of steps to be taken by the parties towards de-escalation. It's not entirely clear who was behind the attack, but the fact that Ansar Allah has claimed responsibility is bad enough. And whatever we will discover of the attack, it is a sure sign that for Yemen, the direction of travel seems to be away from the peace we all seek. And every day that war goes on, the greater the threat, as we see, to regional stability. So we need to take a bold move.
President Trump didn't mention Iran by name in this tweet, deferring to a Saudi investigation to establish responsibility, but warned the United States was locked and loaded.
The United States condemns these attacks in the strongest possible terms, standing firmly with our Saudi friends. We must all be clear-eyed about this event, a direct assault on the world energy supply. Claims of responsibility have been made, but as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has clearly stated, there is no evidence that the attacks came from Yemen. Emerging information indicates that responsibility lies with Iran.
Mr. President,
South Africa cautioned that only a political solution and not a military one was needed in Yemen, calling for a de-escalation.
we condemn the attack on the Saudi oil facilities, and we call all the countries in the region to escalate the tension that might damage the security and stability of the Gulf region and the global energy supply and security.
A spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry rejected the accusation of blame, while Iraq has denied that its territory was used to launch the attacks. The United Kingdom's ambassador Karen Pierce said they were still assessing responsibility for the attacks, but warned that once culpability had been established, that they would then discuss with their partners how to proceed in a responsible manner. China, for its part, called on the parties to the conflict to resolve their differences through dialogue and negotiation and to avoid any further escalation. Sherman Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Now, yesterday, Saudi Arabia's oil supply was fully back online. The kingdom's energy ministry said while weekend attacks halved output, it will achieve 11 million barrels per day capacity by the end of September and 12 million barrels per day by the end of November. The ministry also said it would keep full oil supplies to customers this month, and that Saudi Arabia would keep its role as the secure supplier of global oil markets. Saudi Arabia is expected to take strict measures to prevent future attacks. Now, I'm joined in studio by Reggie Sibia, who is the CEO of the Fuel Retailers Association. Welcome, Mr. Sibia. Welcome to the SABC.
Thank you, Tande.
Now, let's have a chat about the oil market and the fact that South Africa is a net importer of the oil. And once we've bought the oil on the global markets, it's then shipped to us and it arrives via our ports, and then it goes through the pipes and other forms of transportation into the stores and the garages of your fuel retailers' membership.
That's correct, yes.
Now, aren't they worried about what's going on? What should the ordinary person think?
Look, it would be abnormal not to get worried if there is a disruption of any kind. As you've stated, that we are a net importer, and basically what that means is that if the OPEC countries, sneeze, we catch the flu. It's just as simple as that. But having said that, I think the scale of each interruption is to be objectively, measured. So
now, I love the
worried.
way you've put it, that we catch the flu. What kind of flu do we catch, and how does this flu play out?
Well, the flu hits us in two ways. It can hit us in terms of the availability of product. So do we really get the product? Are we going to be prioritized in terms of the markets that demand the product at the time? It also impacts us in terms of the price. As you know, that if there is shortage of product, then there's a high demand, and then the economics takes into play. And the thing is, we actually ultimately have got no control of that.
Yes.
That's why I say we just catches whatever happens. So whatever the international market trends decide to do, we just become basically the victim of that system.
So we're just a price taker here, and we can take, we will have to take the price of oil at a much higher price, won't we now?
We will, definitely. But I just want to comment a bit about some detail that I think personally still needs to be unpacked in this whole story, because if you read, yes, 5% of production has been actually disrupted, but we have no actually insights into what is the storage capacity in Saudi Arabia. And what they've said themselves as a country is that they believe that they will still continue supplying the markets out of their storage reserves. And one will expect a country like that to actually have such alternative strategy planning in case there is a disaster like this, that you actually have storage so that you can continue your supply. So I was a bit relieved, when that kind of news followed the first sort of worrying news. So I'm hoping that the amount of supply product that they have will sustain us until they actually come to normal production. If that happens, then I think the impact will be very minimal.
Yes,
But
in fact, our team, in preparation for chatting to you, sir,
Yes.
did say that that Saudi Arabia has moved to normalize supply very rapidly. And as you correctly point out, this is the leader of OPEC. They've got amazing hedging instruments to mitigate any crisis that may befall the oil supplies.
Yes, yes.
But it did have an impact on the price. And down the line, we were expecting, as South Africans, to have a bit of fuel relief. Is that still going to come to us?
Look, let's put it this way. If you've been following the trends of the prices before this happened, we were still going to have some price increase, especially on ULP 95 and also on diesel. But I think this would actually make that price now be much higher, definitely, than what it was going to be. And there are other factors that were going to affect the price increase. I mean, if you look this time around, European markets are going into winter months, and the use of energy there becomes really very huge. That trend had already started, so we were actually going to get the price increases anyway because of that trend, and this then came into the equation. So, but I believe if it's managed, the impact will not be that big. But going forward, I think we were at the conference, for example, and people were asking, for example, okay, besides the international market prices, what are the other things that we can do? What are the other things that are affecting us? And somebody, because we had like delegates from Swaziland, delegates from Botswana.
All over the region.
Yes, all over the region. And people are saying, but if I cross the border to Swaziland, I get the fuel cheaper. And yet South Africa is supplying Swaziland. So that's where also this issue of then our taxes and our levies.
Can you tell the viewers what accounts for that differential in the price?
It is mainly, if we were to compare like Swaziland and us, because we actually supply them with the product, it is the taxes that are built in that we've got to actually pay in.
The taxes that are built in on our side of the border.
On our side of the border. So Swaziland government obviously is charging lesser taxes from that price, because basically where it starts with a basic fuel pricing, which is basically your, ex-refinery gate price. In simple economic terms, that is just your cost of production. Right. So then from the cost of production, then you need to build up the elements of distribution, and logistics and wholesaling and retailing, then the end consumer. But because this is a regulated, product, then there is then the addition of fuel levies and fuel and taxes, things like the road accident fund, they come in there. So, and they are quite substantial. And there's always this argument of saying, well, okay, if we take it out of fuel, will it then disappear completely? And my view is it won't. It will shift somewhere else.
Now tell me, Mr. SB, I'm very curious about this. What are the ideal market conditions for the fuel retailers in South Africa? What would be the most desirable condition? I mean, it seems your commodity is so vulnerable to geopolitical factors, so one has to ask the question.
You're correct. I think everybody wants a bit of stability, even if it's not, long term, even if it's short term, it makes my planning much more effectively if I know that for the next 6 months, this is the kind of cost of, of sales that I'm going to be having on my, operations. I am able to plan effectively. So it makes our planning quite dramatic because, it's very volatile. And also what happens is that people don't realize that most of the cost of operations are linked to the pump price. For example, your insurance cost is a percentage of your pump price. So when and bank cards transactions, they are a percentage of your pump price. So when the pump price goes up, so your cost of actual operations increases. And yet the margin that you get is cents per liter. So that margin actually shrinks. Every time the price goes up, that margin actually shrinks. So, and our margins are only reviewed once a year.
Gosh, so December. This must have been a very jittery time for your members.
It always be, if there's price increases during the year, we are actually taking the pain, we are taking everything, because also the cost of just securing that cash is very high because of the health and safety issues and crime that is actually around us.
Oh, yes, there are those factors as well, but these few days must have been harrowing for your members, and it must have made for a very interesting conference. What were the highlights from your conference, sir?
Yes, and interestingly enough, we are still businesses, Tandega, that just wants to wake up every day, and have a purpose of living and have a sense of hope, renewal. But we also do realize that there's a lot of changes taking place around us. The key one was the fourth industrial revolution. It's here with us.
What does it mean for your industry?
It means a lot of things. For example, it means that, the customers' ways of shopping are going to change. If we got, for example, electrical vehicles, will there be a need for service stations in the future? Because people will be actually charging at home.
Were you actually talking about this at the conference?
Yes, we are talking about it. We are talking about the skills, because now machinery, digitization, and technology comes and do the jobs that should have been done by humans. What does it say to our job creation? What does it say to our upskilling of people? So we had also international speakers from Europe. We had international speakers from Thailand. And what do they say?
Looking into the future of your industry, what do they see? Do they see decline?
They say we are still fortunate. In a way, as South Africans, we are still fortunate because we are still a regulated industry. Our regulations and legislations are still tight on also protecting jobs. But the fear for the industry is this thing called deregulation. You know, when it comes, what does it mean? So, for example...
It'll probably mean choppy waters even more.
Yes, so that's why most stakeholders in the industry were actually objected very strongly against the proposal earlier this year from the Minister of Energy then to actually introduce maximum pricing on ULP 93, because that's basically now starting to introduce what we call deregulation.
It's de facto deregulation.
What are the effects of introducing deregulation in South Africa? What are we going to do with the jobs? You know, markets where deregulation is effected, they are very strong economically. We're sitting at employment now close to 29%.
And besides,
and we employ
your commodity,
over 80,000 people.
Fuel, as you know, is that tide that lifts all ships. It has an effect on the price of food. It has an inflationary effect throughout the economy, and some degree of regulation does protect the ordinary citizen, doesn't it?
You're right, and it affects people who use public transport, the majority. And you know, the funny thing that people always complain about is that if there's a price increase, even the taxes will increase, you know, their fare. But if there's a price decrease, the fare price, the taxi fare doesn't go down.
And so the cost to an ordinary working class South African to just access an urban town using a taxi rises.
It rises. The other thing, Sister Ndega, that I wanted to just share. You know, people always think that when we deregulate the market, we're going to be happy people. That is actually not actually substantiated by any facts. You go to markets...
Why do we have that fallacy about
regulation? I do not know, because if you go to America today, which has been deregulated for years, you go to Europe, which has been deregulated for years, the price of fuel is actually more even expensive than in South Africa. And on top of that, you know, when I always travel, I like to go to the service station. I see a lady formally dressed like you, Sister Ndega, coming from work, right? Getting out of the car, pull out the pump themselves, put in the petrol, go to that for the tire pressure,
or maybe we're
bend
just
down,
spoiled as South Africans.
but still pay more than what we are paying here.
Yes,
so
indeed.
people are actually very, very misguided. You know what tends to happen is that when deregulation is introduced, everybody starts competing for price because they hope that they're going to gain the market share. But
Isn't it
that
that
rat race...
they think that competition will bring the price down?
It does bring the price down, but the people who bring the price down, they do it because they think they're going to gain more market share. But it comes to a point where everybody keep on responding, and everybody protects their market share. And then the players start realizing that everybody's a loser here. Oh. And then what then happens is that prices start going back up again. That's what happened in all these markets. So it's not a long-term solution. It's a very short-term solution that people will compete. And what also is a tragedy, if you look, for example, in the retail market in Europe, is that when deregulation was actually introduced, the first victims were what we call here in South Africa SMMEs.
Oh, wow.
All the small guys, they actually disappeared out of the radar, and obviously the monopoly being conglomerates, even the supermarkets in Europe started coming into that place. So is that good for our economy? So it's all of those things that when we actually talk about these issues, we need to be a little bit informed about those markets there, and how is our market different from them?
Well, we do hope that you will return to our platform on the SABC to explain these issues further. It's been a fascinating discussion, and good luck to your members.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting us.
Now, we continue with our discussion after the short break. Do stay with us. Now, welcome back. I am now joined by the Automobile Association's spokesperson, Leighton Beard. Hi, Leighton, how are you?
Yeah, good to be with you.
Welcome back to the SABC.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Now, you were privy to the discussion that we had with the Fuel Retailers Association.
Yeah.
What's your take on the main issues?
Yeah, so much to take away from that. In fact, I think the first thing is I think everybody's very grateful by the fact that Saudi Arabia has said that it will return to normal production by the end of November, and that it will meet demands, and that it will supply all its customers. So that certainly is good news. And I think since Saturday, we've seen that the international oil prices have actually come down from those very high record highs that they reached on Monday. We're down to around about $62 a barrel now. So that is good news. I think the concern remains about the vulnerability of this installation in Saudi Arabia. And there's a lot of concern about if this has happened, can it happen again? And if it does happen again, what is the impact of that? So certainly I think in the short term, things are beginning to normalize a little bit. But long term, I think there is a concern about the security around these installations.
But the commodity itself is so vulnerable to geopolitical factors.
100%. I mean, when we look at the South African situation, our fuel price is determined or influenced by two main factors. The first being the Rand-US dollar exchange rate, and then the second, international petroleum prices, oil prices. So when this commodity becomes more expensive, as we've seen, it just means that as a country, we are buying a more expensive product than what we did maybe 10 days ago.
And often we're buying on a weakened rand.
And often we're buying on a weakened rand. So when you combine a weak rand against an expensive product, it obviously means that you're going to pay a lot. You're going to pay a premium for that. And how do you recover that expense? Well, you pass it on to the consumer. And in our case, it means motorists and consumers. And I say consumers because it doesn't only affect motorists, as we know. So if there's a higher fuel price, everybody gets affected by that. And that's how that process works.
And that means the bus strikes, the taxi strikes, and the access to markets of ordinary people and small businesses.
100%. So everybody's affected by that. When the fuel price goes up, we know that the manufacturing sector, for instance, and the agricultural sector, their input costs increase, and they pass those increases on through higher prices. So when there has been an incident like what happened at Cake in Saudi Arabia, you may find that your bananas become more expensive, or that whatever, and so that's how that system works. Higher fuel prices are negative for all consumers, and it's obviously something that we're very concerned about. Reggie mentioned the taxes that get paid for a litre of fuel. There is a lot to be said about those taxes, obviously pro and con, but I think he also made the point, if you take those taxes off that litre of fuel, where do you recover them? What other taxes will then be implemented to make up the money that you would lose from those fuel taxes?
So we should ideally cushion ourselves with a healthy cushion of reserves. Was it wise for us to deplete our reserves?
I think the decision has been made. That's a very tough and loaded question. I think the decision has been made, or the decision was made, to sell those reserves. It may be a decision that later on comes back to haunt us.
Was it a surreptitious decision because we then learned of it later?
I think, to look back on it, we may make a lot of informed decisions about what should or shouldn't have happened. The fact of the matter is that it has happened. I think the important part of your question is, what do we do going forward? And how do we deal with something like what happened in Saudi Arabia going forward, and how do we cushion ourselves against that? And that may be an issue for discussion, and that may be the impetus we need to actually say, well, because of what happened there, we now need to look at maybe improving our reserves.
I mean, given the developmental impact of high fuel prices, which is devastating on an already cash-strapped consumer, and in a country where domestic incomes are in decline. What is the thinking about cushioning us through developing a certain level of legislated reserves?
Look, I think that's a question that you need to ask of the Department of Energy, and they would be in a position to offer a much more succinct and articulate answer than I would.
But you're a player in the
look,
market.
Obviously, I think, from our point of view as the AA, we are very concerned about the impact that rising fuel costs have on consumers, not only motorists, but on all consumers. And certainly we would like to get to a state where consumers are protected and cushioned against these rising fuel prices. Now, we've mentioned the taxes. Do we take the taxes off? We don't think that that's a good idea because you've got to recover them somewhere else. Is there space for us to say, let's cushion ourselves in terms of reserves? There certainly could be space for that. But again, I think it's not for us to say that that must happen, but certainly I think there is space for that discussion to begin.
I mean, you would lobby for our interests as
For sure.
Automobile owners and so on. What instruments would you say government should play with to insulate ourselves against price shocks in this industry?
Yeah, very tough question to answer because I think, as you and Reggie discussed, South Africa's fuel and the fuel price really is dependent on geopolitical developments. So one of the big factors that influences our fuel price locally is the Rand-US dollar exchange rate. And Reggie alluded to the fact that we need policy stability in South Africa. So in terms of the Rand and where the government can have some control over the factors that influence the fuel price, political stability is necessary, economic stability is necessary, a climate of certainty is necessary, investor confidence must be improved. Those are the things the government has some control over in terms of manipulating the environment in which the fuel price is influenced. When you look at what happened in Saudi Arabia, we had obviously no influence over that at all. And the international oil prices are set on the international market. So the one factor that we have some control over is in relation to the exchange rate and the value of the Rand against the dollar. How do we mitigate that? Policy stability, economic stability, a climate of political stability and certainty. These are the things that we need to...
Foreign exchange reserves.
Foreign exchange reserves. We certainly don't need events of the last 2 weeks which are negatively impacting on our currency. Those are the types of things that I think we need to pay closer attention to.
What role, I think, I'm curious to find out, do you think economic diplomacy can play in South Africa securing itself better deals in this market, if any?
Look, I think we need to give credit to the government that there are some very sharp people in there that are doing exactly what you are suggesting they do. So I think deals are struck and deals are negotiated, and people are certainly making the best deals that they can for South Africa. But I think we need to be realistic about this and understand that we are one player amongst many, many others. And so while we want to negotiate the best deal for us, there are others that want to negotiate the best deals for themselves. In terms of the Rand, I think that we've been very clear about some of the things that need to happen to make the Rand stronger. In terms of the oil price and the international prices we pay, I think we're also very clear that there is only so much we can do to influence that.
Couldn't we possibly look at the locus of supply, those countries from which we draw our supplies, to de-emphasize the Middle Eastern sources of oil supply and look at Africa? Kenya has recently discovered oil. Could we not order more of theirs? Order more from Angola and from Nigeria?
I mean, the question has been posed over and over again, why are we not getting more oil supplies from African countries? Well, we are getting oil supplies from African countries. Do we need to increase that? Certainly, that's a policy decision that the government needs to consider, and they need to take the lead on that. I think when it comes to oil and when it comes to the fuel price in South Africa, a lot of people in the country feel that there are better alternatives. From discussions that we've had with many players within this industry, those discussions certainly are valid, but they're not things that people haven't thought of already. You know, these things are considered and have been thought of many, many times over the years. The situation we're in at the moment, I think, people need to be very clear on that. And that is
have we actioned our options sufficiently?
I can't answer that question. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that over the last 24 years, I would certainly imagine that we have.
And what do you think the future of this industry is? Are you going to be encouraging us one day to just dump oil and petrol, zoot around in electronic cars?
I think the world is going towards electronic vehicles, but we need to be realistic as well that electronic vehicles bring with them their own challenges. They need power and energy supply. And, you know, in a country like South Africa, where we have seen energy supply being very volatile, that needs to be factored into your decision as well. Certainly, we would like to see a situation in this country where people have access to mobility, where people have access to cheap, effective, efficient public transport, which is cheap, We would like to obviously see a reduction in the number of fatalities on our roads. So I think the future is, in our minds, in terms of mobility, very exciting, but there are obviously a number of challenges that need to be met. Is petrol going to disappear in South Africa?
Not soon.
Maybe, but in 150 years, maybe.
Now, can you advise the ordinary consumer? Advise me, for example. I can't stockpile because it's against the law.
Yeah.
What can I do to hedge myself and my domestic budget against shocks?
So I think the most important thing that you need to do is you need to determine whether your vehicle and your petrol usage is important to your everyday life. And if you've made the call that it is important to you and that you can't live without your vehicle and that your petrol spend is becoming more every month and that it's becoming out of control, you may want to relook at your budget and say, well, maybe the Jimmy Choos are going to stay on the shelf this month and I'll rebudget and buy fuel instead. It's
Leave the Jimmy Choos aside. What about my bicycle? What about alternative modes of transportation?
Absolutely. So relooking at your budget is very important and making sure that if your vehicle is important to you and you need your fuel, that you've got yourself covered for that. Using a bicycle is a very good idea. We always say to people, if you can avoid those short trips in your vehicle by either bicycling or using your feet to get to a destination, that is a good idea.
You know, we had an MEC here in Gauteng who used to encourage us to get on and cycle.
Yes, and it certainly has its benefits. From a cost perspective, if you are able to cycle and you are able to do that, then that's certainly going to help with your fuel budget. It's not something that everybody can do. We know that a lot of people work very far from where they live, and so they obviously are reliant on their vehicles. You may want to consider carpooling. That is something that you can consider. Again, if you're going to do that, just tell your insurer about that. We always encourage people to use public transport if it is available, if it is cheaper than the fuel, if it is efficient, and if it is reliable. Unfortunately, it isn't in many parts, all three of those things, and that's something that we would obviously like to see changed.
So part of the policy mix is looking at these alternative transport modes for the ordinary consumer.
Right.
And looking at how we as a country can improve public transport so that we reduce the burden on commuters who have to enter the cities.
Public transport is incredibly important. And I think that, when people want to get somewhere, they want to get there now. And they want to make sure that if they're going to make use of public transport, it is going to be reliable. So you don't want to get to a bus stop and wait, 15, 20 minutes for a bus that should have been there 15 or 20 minutes ago. That may influence whether you get to the job interview or whether you get to your job. Or you get fired. So you want reliable public transport. So that's quite critical. And I completely concur with you. We are moving into a situation where public transport needs to become more of a priority. And we certainly hope that when the government looks at transport and mobility going forward, that public transport factors as one of their priorities.
And it actually becomes more urgent in the view of the fact that we as a society haven't been able to transform our apartheid urban planning. You'll have the majority of poor black people staying outside of the cities and at a great distance to the cities, and therefore they are far from their places of work and heavily reliant on taxis and buses. And when the prices go up, their domestic incomes go down.
Sure. People are at the mercy of the fuel price, and I think people don't understand exactly how much they are at the mercy of the fuel price. And it's not only that immediate impact when the fuel price goes up, it's the long-term impact of the fuel price increases on the economy, on inflation, on products that we buy. And when that fuel price goes up, it means that everybody has to spend more on fuel and their expendable cash becomes less. And if you've got very little expendable cash to begin with, it just means that your budget is going to be stretched even further. We are extremely concerned about the fuel price. We are extremely concerned about the impact of all of these increases on consumers, which is exactly why we want people to be educated about it. Absolutely.
So tell me, Leighton, in the dying minutes of this interview, how many cars do we have out there on South African roads? What's your
There's
estimation?
about 12.5 million registered vehicles in South Africa. And obviously we know that they use a lot of fuel. And people are very reliant on their vehicles. Again, I think I bring you back to this issue of do we have sufficient public transport in South Africa? Do we have sufficient focus on road safety in South Africa? And these are some of the issues that we as the AA are focused on at the moment.
And that will be quite a multi-pronged approach that
Sure.
this country should adopt in resolving the issues of high fuel prices.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thank you very much, Tandeka.
Thank you very much for joining us, dear viewer. Good night out there. Khonandin.